Good morning and welcome back to Policies and Pocketbooks. This is Thuy Lowe, your host on the Policies and Pocketbooks. I'm here every Saturday from 11 a.m. to noon. This is a live broadcast on FM 105.5 and AM 660. The Answer. You can always streaming live this conversation by going to theanswerorlando.com or tune in my weekly show by downloading our app at AM 660, The Answer Orlando on your smart device. Follow me on Twitter. Like me on Facebook. That is Thuy Lowe, THUYLOWE. So I want to welcome everyone back. We have a great guest in the house with us this morning. His name is Dr. Kim Holmes. He is an executive vice president of the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Holmes, or Dr. Holmes, was selected by the Heritage Board of Trustees as the second person in command in February of this year. So congratulations to you, sir.
Thank you, Thuy.
Following the selection of its president, Mrs. Cole James. Dr. Holmes served as an assistant secretary at the U.S. State Department during President George W. Bush's administration. He is an author of 3 books. You may have heard of his books and may have some of his books. One of them is Liberty's Best Hope, American Leadership for the 21st Century, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great, and The Closing of the Liberal Mind, which is the topic of our conversation for today. He is an historian, a scholar, and an expert on areas of global politics, missile defense, Europe, and terrorism. And I want to welcome Dr. Holmes to our show this morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, Thuy, it's a pleasure to be here with you, to meet you and everyone here at the radio station. It's great to be back in Central Florida, my old home state. It's also really great to get out of Washington, D.C.
Talking about your home state, we were just talking about University of Central Florida before we got on the show today. And he is a UCF alumni, the Knights, UCF Knights.
Yeah, that's right. I graduated in 1974 when there was something like 2,800 students.
Oh, my
Not
goodness.
the 70,000 that are there now. It was a tiny place back then, but it was a great experience. I was there from 70 to 74, studied history. As a matter of fact, in the history department there, and went on to get a PhD from Georgetown University in history.
Wow. Talking about UCF and the Orlando area, I came to the United States in 1975 as a Vietnamese immigrant with my parents. And we were sponsored by a church, a Lutheran church in Winter Park, and that's how we became residents of the Orlando and Central Florida area. And I have lived here for 43 years. And I tell you, though, and we're going to get into this conversation here in a little bit, but the environment today is so different than when I grew up in 1975 in the Central Florida area. I went to a high school, Edgewater High School. I went to Robert E. Lee Junior High and an elementary school, Hillcrest Elementary School here, and I learned to speak English. And at that time, there wasn't that many Asians in the area. There was predominantly white population in Central Florida at the time. And I tell you, I was not treated as a minority. I was not treated with any discrimination. The black students, those black students that I went to school with, were treated as human beings. They were treated by their peers with respect. As an immigrant and a Vietnamese and someone who didn't really speak English very well, I was elected as student council president in high school 5 or 6 years after coming into America. And the senior president of my class, the graduating class, he was black. He was a student council president. He was a football player. So back then, we didn't have the racism and divisiveness that we have today. In Central Florida today, I have to tell you, where I am seeing, very hostile environment in terms of racial division.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not what I grew up with, and I don't understand where the conversation came from.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that I discuss the history of in my book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. I take what was historically, at least in the 20th century and after the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., the way that race and ethnicity was to be dealt with in the traditional American civil rights movement that King and others had supported was people were to be treated individually, regardless of their race. And today, the people who call themselves liberals, actually, they're from what I call in the book the multicultural left. They take a different view of race. It's not only exacerbating divisions between the races, but it's creating racial groupings that have sort of a zero-sum competition with white people. And it's intentionally quite divisive because the intention is to create a sort of a majority of minorities as a voting bloc, mainly for the Democratic Party. And so they have to stoke the differences. They have to really increase the grievances, and also make sure that people and minorities have more of identification with their own minority group than they do with others, other Americans. And so it's a kind of what we call the balkanization of social America. And that did not exist when you first came here. I mean, it did exist in the margins of American politics back in the 70s, but it's gotten far worse over the last 40 years. And now there's a whole cottage industry of community organizers, universities write books about, identity politics, and the whole purpose of it is actually to divide people. And so the unifying experience that you had when you came here, like most immigrants should have, and many immigrants did have, by becoming an American and not becoming identified just with some racial or ethnic group, that unfortunately is no longer a liberal cause. It's actually a cause of the multicultural left.
You mentioned about, you just mentioned of the word liberal.
Yeah, I mean liberal in the classic sense of being tolerant.
Well, let's go back to the history for a little bit.
Yeah.
The classical liberalism is not the same thing as today.
Absolutely.
Liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
The classical liberal
classic liberal, yeah.
Yeah, liberalism.
Yeah.
The philosophy behind that was created by our founding fathers,
mm-hmm.
which is embedded in our Constitution,
mm-hmm.
and it's basically it nurtured the message of liberty, economic liberty, and civil liberty.
That's right.
Now, as a historian, tell us the difference between classical liberalism
mm-hmm.
and modern day liberalism.
Yeah. You're exactly right. I don't want to confuse everybody too much with terminology, liberal, conservative. Really what many people today call conservative is really a classic form of liberalism. That is a belief in individual liberty, a belief in tolerating differences of opinion. This was the vision of the Founding Fathers, and it was put into the Declaration and in the Constitution. And it's I work at the Heritage Foundation, so when we talk about the Heritage Foundation, the heritage we're talking about preserving is the heritage of the American founding. So this creed, if you will, of individual liberty and respecting the rights of individuals that will be derived from natural law, or if you're religious, from God, that the government was constituted to protect those liberties. And that is a classic liberal idea that today we call it conservative. But what's happened over the last 50 or 60 years, particularly with the rise of what I call the New Left in the 1960s, which were basically neo-Marxists. They started out in the student movement in the 60s. They ended up marching through the institutions of American campuses. They believed in a kind of cultural Marxism of dividing people along lines of class, gender, ethnicity, and race. And the line that they were selling is that all these minorities were being oppressed by either capitalism and white people. And so this Marxist view of the world, which was in the old days, it was about the proletariat and the working class, but now it's a cultural thing. It's a social thing. This idea was invented in the 1960s, mostly through the immigration of a lot of European Marxists like Herbert Marcuse and people like that. It came from Germany and went into our American universities. And now it's pretty much the common creed of the Democratic Party. They call themselves liberal because that's just the term that's been used now for ages, but they're not really liberal in this sense at all. They're actually leftists. And leftists or socialism or communism in the extreme is a very intolerant, very authoritarian ideology. It's not about tolerance. It's not about individual freedom. It's about classes and social groups that need to gain power and then exercise that power against other people. And so that idea is now the dominant philosophy of what people who call themselves liberal is. But in the book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind, I try to show the history. It's not liberal at all. What does liberal mean to most people? Liberal means tolerant. In other words, listening to opposing points of view, having an open mind, having an argument about something. You know, the old saying is that I may disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death for you to express yourself. In other words, freedom of speech. Well, it's no secret that on many American campuses today, you can barely, if you're a conservative, you can't go there without having somebody shut you down. They're extremely intolerant. They're extremely closed-minded. They're not liberal in that definition at all. So and that's because they have authoritarian mindset that's not liberal. That's the main point of my book.
So the term liberal is very misleading.
Absolutely it is.
And in your book, I believe chapter 3 or 4, you were talking about progressivism.
Yeah.
And they're not progressive.
No, they're even
not progressive either.
No, they're not. They're actually much more radical than what we call progressives. Progressivism arose up in the end of the 19th century with Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and people like that. It was influenced by socialism from Europe, but it was a very American creed or interpretation of sort of social democracy, as they eventually end up calling it. But it was there was a respect in the early 20th century for freedom of expression. As a matter of fact, the New Left in the early 60s, when it broke out, the free speech movement broke out on the campus of University of California, Berkeley, it was called the free speech movement. And it was basically the New Left declaring war on progressive liberalism. That is, the liberalism of FDR, the liberalism of Truman, the sort of classic liberalism, if you will, progressive liberalism that had existed in the early half of the 20th century. But these new guys, even though they called themselves the free speech movement, it was like they were really, as I said, they were cultural Marxists. And so once they got into power, and many of them now occupy the commanding heights of many American institutions, particularly our universities, then they start closing the door. They're not tolerant anymore of opposing opinion. Now they don't support freedom of speech because that was their true stripes all along, because they're not like classic liberals. They do not believe in the competition of ideas. They believe that they have a philosophy that will bring the end of history, just like the communists did decades ago. And it's becoming much more radical, much more extreme than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. That's what prompted me to write the book, because I saw what was happening in the name of liberalism, and it struck me that a lot of people today who call themselves a liberal are getting away with an awfully lot of things that are just not liberal.
Folks, you are listening to Thuy Lowe on Policies and Pocketbooks. We are honored to have Dr. Kim Holmes in the studio with us this morning. He is the Executive Vice President of the Heritage Foundation, at the second person in command in this huge organization. That is a great, big responsibility to continue the conservative movement.
No, thank you.
We're talking about American political landscape, and we're touching base on his book, which was published in 2016 with the name of
The Closing of the Liberal
thank you,
Mind.
The Closing of the Liberal Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you notice the movement, or when did Americans move from classical liberalism to the modern day, for lack of a better word, liberalism?
Well, I
can say conservatism a lot better.
Yeah, well,
than modern day liberalism.
Yeah, as I said, I'm going to probably confuse the audience. What we're talking about really is what we call conservatism today. But I'm an historian, and I try to keep the idea straight. To answer your question, it's what I mentioned a minute ago. You've been
in politics for a long, long time.
Yeah, it really started in earnest in the 1960s. That's where the big turn. It came with the baby boomers entering, my generation, entering college. There had been, after World War II, many of the New Deal Democrats and liberals had come back after the war in the 1950s, and America was booming. Many of them were sort of Franklin Roosevelt liberals. My grandparents were Franklin Roosevelt liberals, but they were not anywhere stretch of the imagination, anywhere near being a Marxist. They were just progressive liberals. They believed in state intervention in the economy. They believed in Social Security and then later Medicare and things like that. But they did not have this sort of Marxist construct of philosophy of creating grievances among social groups in order to gain power. Because Marxism is really a philosophy of power and how to get power and how to keep power. And that's that, if I had to say, the most important thing to understand about the multicultural left today is that although, just like any times you find the left, they always say that they're doing something for the little person. But at the end of the day, it's about getting power and gaining power. So to answer your question, it happened in the 60s. And it first started with the student movement, with the SDS. But that revolution, there was an attempted revolution in the 1960s. After all, there was riots in the streets. The National Guard had to be sent into Kent State, and they actually fired on the students in 1970, killing a couple of students. It was a very violent time. But the revolution, the direct revolution of using violence at that time failed. And many of the people who were involved in the social revolutionary movements back in those years, in the 60s, they realized that being confrontational and trying to take power directly was not going to work. So they took off their sandals, they cut their hair, they put on suits, and they started marching through the institutions. And first they went into the universities and became professors, then they became deans, then they became provosts, then they became university professors. They've been marching through every major American institution today there is, all the way up now to the point where they're occupying corporate boardrooms. The entertainment industry has long been extremely liberal, and even the mainline churches are this way.
What is the path and the danger here of this revolution? Because we are seeing a new revolution, or maybe a revisit of the revolution in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah.
Of being chaotic, of being disruptive, of being, like you said earlier, very intolerant, very hostile environment. Well, how dangerous do you see here as we're heading into the future? Or is there going to be another civil war coming up here between ideologies and?
Well, I don't want to predict the future. I think it's quite concerning that the polarization in America today that everybody sees, everybody knows it's there. That's the result of this movement on the hard left. that I'm talking about. A lot of people want to try to blame everything on Donald Trump. There would be no Donald Trump if there had not been 8 years of Barack Obama, because Barack Obama was the first new left president this country has ever had. The one, when I say new left, I mean that view, that radical view of the 1960s. He was completely in sync with that view. Bill Clinton was not. Bill Clinton was sort of a hodgepodge of new left but old left. He was a lot more moderate. Bill Clinton was when he was president than Barack Obama was. So we crossed a precipice, I believed, with the presidency of Barack Obama, and now we have this tremendous polarization that is probably is a result of this this conflict that I've been talking about. It's been going on now for like 40, 45 years.
A lot of Americans see Barack Obama as a passive president. How did this movement, how was he able to drive the new movement?
He had a very his demeanor was the opposite of the radical president. So that managed, a lot of people saw his demeanor as being calm and the like, and so that reassured them. But the only reason he could get away with that demeanor, while he actually did quite a lot of radical things with the power as a president, is because he had the cover of the media.
Share with us some of the activities that he did.
I mean, if for example, he had there was a bill before the Congress called the DREAM Act, which was to deal with the children of immigrants. And it could not get through the Congress because there were not enough votes to get it. He just decided to go back and implement it through an executive order. Complete abuse of the power of the presidency. And there was just hardly a hiccup. And there are other instances where he abused executive power. There were instances where he would actually go after and target journalists, and even had the Justice Department look in and investigate them. But because the media was so sympathetic to him, they wouldn't get any traction in any of the stories about it. So the perception was that everything was kind of cool and nothing was happening. But actually, it was a revolution, really, not only in the philosophy that he represented, but also in the expansion of federal power and executive power that was really unprecedented.
Now, you are an executive vice president of the Heritage Foundation, the second person in command in the leadership team. From what I understand, Heritage Foundation is very aggressive and continue, and you mentioned it earlier, to continue to preserve our constitutional foundation.
Mm-hmm.
What is that task like for you in today's political environment?
Well, it's a challenge, but we rise to the challenge. We have a lot of supporters. We have over 500,000 supporters. We have lots of allies and friends in the administration and in Congress that we work with. So we're able to get things done. We're the voice for many conservatives in America, in Washington, and that's why we were in Washington. It's true, but we're a think tank. We have 90 researchers. We do policy research on everything from tax reform to the Supreme Court, to school safety, healthcare, foreign policy. I mean, we're a full-service think tank. But the thing is that it's important for everybody to realize is that what we do is we take the principles that I talked about earlier about constitutional government, free enterprise, individual rights, a strong national defense, and the importance of civil society. That's our starting point philosophically. And then we have those principles inform what policy recommendations that we make through our analysis. And then we fan out and try to get our message out to the media and the Congress and elsewhere. So that's what we do. And we've been really quite successful. President Trump, the Trump administration has in our last count, implemented about 64% of the recommendations that we made in a study 2 years ago that we hope the next president would make. And we've been influential in framing the tax cut bill that just happened. So we've been doing a lot.
So what does that look like for you moving forward here? How do you how do you see the result? Oh, what do you see as the result from the 2018 election, and how would that impact the vision and the mission of the Heritage Foundation?
Well, one of the things about Heritage is we have a saying, is that presidents and Congresses come and go, the Heritage Foundation remains. And so President K. James has a saying, when people ask us, how do you navigate the politics of Washington? And we say, we don't have to navigate. All we have to do is stand up. And so we have the luxury, since we're a philosophical group, we can always say what we believe, even if it doesn't agree with even President Trump. President Trump has some views on international trade that we disagree with. We're free traders, and we're concerned about that. So all of that to say is it doesn't matter who's in charge of Congress, we will still be there.
How do you perceive the American political landscape? What does that look like to you here in the next 4 to 8 years?
Well, we're probably going to have to go through a fairly extended period where the two-party system is essentially dysfunctional. And one of the reasons why it is because people who call themselves liberals are all in one party, and people who call themselves conservatives are in another party. The genius of the two-party system in America for many, many years, the reason why it works so well, is that the Republican Party had a little liberal wing, and the Democratic Party had a conservative wing. And so therefore, there was pragmatic politics worked quite well when you had the two-party systems working together. Right now, it's a power struggle between two ideologically opposed units or political parties. And so compromise is a dirty word. So the only way for us to get around that is for the American electorate to shift the center of what is considered to be the center of American politics. So the extremes that you find completely arising out of the Democratic Party are not producing themselves in the primary system, for example, the way they are. Right now, what we call the middle just doesn't exist.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time. And I really thank you so much for you being here with me today, talking about the landscape of American politics. And I hope that you will consider coming back and join us again in the future, because we have a lot to talk about.
Well, that went very fast. Thank you very much,
30 seconds.
I was ready to go for another half an hour.
Yes. Well, this is Thuy Lowe on Policies and Pocketbooks. I want to thank you, everyone, for joining me for another great conversation today. And I hope you all will join me again next week. Have a wonderful weekend.